America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. And for today's episode, I will be looking at T.R., The Last Romantic by H.W. Brands. I had actually thought before I started my podcast that the book was called Teddy Roosevelt, The Last Romantic, but it's not. It's just called T.R., The Last Romantic, but it's about Teddy Roosevelt, who is a pretty interesting figure, an interesting Republican president. I am sort of the opinion that Teddy Roosevelt is a dividing figure between the 20th century Republican Party and the 19th century party, which was really like the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. And I think there's a sort of shape to the Republican Party from the Civil War up through McKinley. And then there's a sort of different shape for the party after McKinley's assassination, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, when it was a little bit more interventionist, a little bit more moving toward the direction of what we see in some of the 20th century Republican Party. There's good things about Teddy Roosevelt. There's, not as good things. In general, I think he was a good president. He was a good figure, a good role model. I don't agree with everything that he, all of his policies, but on the whole, he was a good president. I want to focus, like in all of my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections of this book, and I want to focus on a few parts in chapters 20, 22, 23, and 24, because I want to focus specifically on Teddy Roosevelt's interactions with the Japanese. I thought that was a sort of nice way to zero in on one particular part of his life. He's got a very interesting life. There's certainly lots to talk about, but I just want to focus on this one area because I think it says a lot. It says some things about him and his disposition. It says some things I think that can be interpreted for how we should approach foreign policy in the present by looking at how it was addressed in the past, what things he did right, what things he did wrong, and we can try to learn some lessons from that. So that's what I want to focus on here is Teddy Roosevelt's interactions with Japan. And his interactions with Japan mainly begin toward the end of his, not to say there was no interactions, but the most important aspects of his interactions with Japan really came at the end of his time as president. He acted as a mediator between Russia and Japan. Russia and Japan had recently had a war, and in order to bring the war to an adequate conclusion, Teddy Roosevelt stepped in as a mediator to facilitate the discussions between Russia and Japan to settle on some sort of a peace agreement. Then there was more afterwards, after the interactions as his dealings as a mediator. There was more later on when it had to do with immigration, and I'll get there in a moment, but I'm going to start here reading this section when he talks about his activity as a mediator in the war. And so here he says, quote, "Since the beginning of 1904, Japan and Russia had been locked in a deadly contest for supremacy in northeastern Asia. The war began with a stunningly successful Japanese sneak attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Although this hardly comported with Marquess of Queensberry rules, Roosevelt couldn't help admiring Japan's daring and initiative. He followed the fighting closely. 'How absorbing the Far Eastern business has been,' he declared to journalist Whitelaw Reid in mid-February. 'I cannot understand Russia, having been caught so unprepared and supine.' Laxity aside, the president thought the Russians had brought their current troubles on themselves. 'For several years,' he told Ted, 'Russia has behaved very badly in the Far East. Her attitude toward all nations, including us, but especially toward Japan, being grossly overbearing.' Roosevelt had expected a clash between Japan and Russia. His principal fear had been that Russia might beat Japan and become more obnoxious than ever. 'I was apprehensive lest, if she at the very outset whipped Japan on the sea, she might assume a position well nigh intolerable toward us. Just the opposite had occurred, to the President's private satisfaction. Between ourselves, for you must not breathe it to anybody, he told his son, I was thoroughly pleased with the Japanese victory, for Japan is playing our game. As an additional caution to confidentiality, Roosevelt appended a warning. Be sure not to let this letter stay around where it could be seen by anyone, for it might cause trouble. As long as Japan continued to play America's game, Roosevelt kept his distance from the fray. He had next to nothing good to say about the current condition of Russia. I believe in the future of the Slavs if they can take the right turn, he told Spring Rice. But I do not believe in the future of any race while it is under a crushing despotism. The Japanese are non-Aryan and non-Christian, but they are under the weight of no such despotism as the Russians. And so, although the Russians are fundamentally nearer to us, or rather would be, if a chance were given them, they are not, in actual fact, nearer to us at present. People who feel as we do would be happier today living in Japan than living in Russia. Yet while Roosevelt didn't complain that Japan had knocked the smugly boorish smile off Russia's official face, neither did he welcome the thought of a decisive Japanese victory in the war. If the Japanese win out, not only the Slav, but all of us will have to reckon with the great new force in Eastern Asia. For the other contenders for influence in the area, including the United States, the lands bordering the Japanese and Chinese seas represented one interest among many. For Japan, they were everything. Until now, a rough balance of power among the several contenders had kept anyone from grabbing the great prize of Eastern Asia, China. A decisive victory over Russia might well tip the balance in Japan's favor and tempt Tokyo to seize that prize. And it might produce such a civilization-shattering transformation as occurred only once or twice each epoch. If Japan set out to reorganize China, all the world would have to take notice. There will result a real shifting of the center of equilibrium as far as the white races are concerned. Personally, I believe that Japan will develop herself and seek to develop China along paths which will make the first and possibly the second great civilized powers. But the civilization must, of course, be of a different type from our civilizations. Race would play a part, but not the determining part. I do not mean that mere race taken by itself would cause such a tremendous difference. I have met Japanese and even Chinese, educated in our ways, who in all the emotions and ways of thought were well nigh identical with us, but the weight of their own ancestral civilization will press upon them, and will prevent their ever coming into exactly our mold. End quote. So there you can kind of see how Roosevelt's watching this from afar. And he's kind of enthusiastic about Japan. And there are more sections here I'm going to skip over, but he just speaks very enthusiastically. He's a fan. He's a fan of Japan and the Japanese way of life, and he wants to sort of bring them into the family of civilized nations. At the same time, as it does say in that section I read, there was some hesitation about Japan. He wasn't really a fan of Russia, and so he thought it was kind of fine for Russia to get put in its place, so to speak. But then he thought, well, there also is the chance of Japan becoming, a major power, and at some point the U.S. will have to contend with that. At a later section, he does say, Roosevelt himself says, I am perfectly well aware that if they win out, they may possibly mean a struggle between them and us in the future. So he understands that Japan is kind of coming into its own as a international power and as a great civilization. And he's kind of enthusiastic about it. And it's hard to really say why, but he's a fan of the Japanese. He's a fan of the Japanese culture. So be it. That's fair. But then it comes to a point when the war is moving on toward its conclusion, and he says, quote, the first months of 1905 brought additional Japanese victories. In February, Port Arthur fell, and Japanese troops drove deep into Manchuria. Still, the Russians refused to seek an end to the struggle, placing their hopes in the Baltic battle fleet that was racing across the Indian Ocean on its way to crush the Japanese armada. The Russian ships arrived in late May. To the astonishment of the world, they were utterly annihilated in the Battle of Tsushima Strait. Roosevelt was as shocked as the rest. He had thought the Japanese might hold their own, but he certainly didn't expect them to smash the Russians so thoroughly. No one anticipated that it would be a rout and a slaughter rather than a fight, he told Lodge, that the Russian fleet would be absolutely destroyed while the Japanese fleet was left practically uninjured. The climactic battle convinced all parties that the fighting had gone just about far enough. The Russians finally realized that they weren't going to win back what they had lost. The Japanese believed they had proved their point and didn't want to overreach. The European powers hoped for a quick settlement that would preserve at least some semblance of a balance in northeastern Asia. In addition, the German emperor feared that the disaster in the Far East would unleash the demons of revolution in Russia, whence they might burst forth against regimes in other countries, including his own. End quote. So then you see there that the Japanese essentially won the war for all practical purposes. The Russian fleet sailed to Japan, and the Japanese fleet annihilated it. The Russians had reached a point where they weren't going to win. The Japanese felt they had proved a point, and everyone was ready to go to the negotiating table. And I think what's interesting here is you have to step back a little bit and look at the circumstances of this conflict. So Russia's center of power is Moscow, is in, the western portion of Russia by Europe, near Europe. All their power centers, their political centers are next to Europe, are essentially a part of Europe, more or less, connected with Eastern Europe culturally, and not exactly connected with Japan culturally, not in the same way. And so Russia's extending way across its across the world. I mean, this is very far away from Moscow. Russia's extending itself across Asia and right into Japan's backyard. Japan, feeling threatened, presumably by Russia's presence so close to their borders, and I don't know the entirety of the background of this war, but Russia had done various things and made various provocations, and Teddy Roosevelt says that a lot of this conflict is Russia's fault, and yet it's Japan who strikes the first blow. He says a stunning sneak attack from Japan on Port Arthur that didn't follow the rules of warfare as they were understood at the time. But nevertheless, Teddy Roosevelt kind of admires the audacity. So think about what you've got. Russia expanding its empire right up to Japan. Japan is a proud nation and doesn't really want to have Russia intruding in what it considers its territories, its territorial waters, or the land just adjacent to Japan. Doesn't want Russia there. So Japan strikes first. And Teddy Roosevelt looks at this and doesn't say, Japan attacked Russia, so therefore, we can just say clearly Japan is in the wrong because they struck first. You can't just look at a conflict and say, well, who dealt the first blow? Who initiated the conflict? There's certainly other stuff that goes on behind the scenes, leading the countries to be at war. There's stuff going on behind the scenes leading Japan to make that attack. So it's not so simple as to say, well, who initiated conflict? Who struck first? That's just not enough. Moreover, because Teddy Roosevelt is trying to bring this situation to a peaceful conclusion and doesn't really want to have a massive international conflict unfolding any more so than it already has, he's happy to bring the parties to the negotiating table. And he's not just sitting and taking one side. He actually likes the Japanese more. Nevertheless, he brings everybody to the negotiating table and And that's the part that I'm going to get to right now. He says, quote, "Each side seemed to harbor exaggerated notions of what it might win through negotiations." Basing his forecast on Tokyo's recent actions, Roosevelt predicted, "Doubtless Japan will desire even more than her interests require." The Russians were worse. "The chief trouble is with Russia, which keeps being shifty and which will try to escape without paying any penalty whatsoever that is adequate for the defeat into which her own policy led her." Roosevelt did his best to bring the expectations of both sides into consonance with reality. To this end, he reluctantly accepted Washington as the venue for discussions, and he acted as go-between in setting the ground rules. The Japanese intended to vest their negotiators with full decision-making power, at the same time that the president urged the Russians to do likewise, so as to convince even the most doubting that Russia was negotiating in earnest. He told Tokyo that the issue of the precise powers of the negotiators was not in the least a vital question, certainly not something to hold the talks hostage to. Roosevelt never would have made a good full-time diplomat. He was too impatient, and now he ached to cut through the niceties of form and start pickaxing at the obdurate substance underneath. "It is for the real interests of Japan to make peace," he told Lodge, "if she can get favorable terms, rather than fight on for a year at great cost of men and money, and then find herself in possession of eastern Siberia, which is of no value to her, and much strained by the struggle. Russia had far better make peace now, if she possibly can, and find her boundaries in East Asia left without material shrinkage from what they were 10 years ago, than to submit to being driven out of East Asia." American interests, too, indicated a settlement about now. "For the rest of us, while Russia's triumph would have been a blow to civilization, her destruction as an Eastern Asiatic power would also, in my opinion, be unfortunate. It is best that she should be left face to face with Japan, so that each may have a moderate action on the other." This mutually moderative action was Roosevelt's goal. He continued to jawbone the Russians and Japanese governments to cease their posturing and cancel their preconditions and get down to the business of ending the war. Those two governments continued to take one step forward, then one step back, then two steps sideways, trying to gain an edge in the peace conference that everyone agreed was impending, if not exactly imminent. Meanwhile, of course, soldiers on both sides continued to die. Finally, Roosevelt's persistence paid off, and St. Petersburg and Tokyo agreed to send their foreign ministers to America for peace talks. End quote. So finally, they're coming to meet. But he does say there, he says that Russia is trying to escape without paying any penalty whatsoever that is adequate for the defeat into which her own policy led her. So despite the fact that Japan initiated the conflict, Roosevelt still looks at this and said, Russia's policies led her into this situation. Policies that presumably were outside the bounds of hot war, had nevertheless engaged in policies that provoked Japan to make the attack. And therefore, he says that, Russia still has to pay some price for what it has done, even though it was attacked by Japan. Which is not really, doesn't seem to be the way that some particular politicians in the present era want to approach conflict. But he also, it's important that he says, look, it's in America's best interest for this not to drag on too long. It's in America's best interests for neither of these great powers to become totally dominant in this part of the world. And so he tries to negotiate a settlement. And regarding that, it says, quote, en route to Portsmouth, the foreign envoys visited the president on Long Island. The chief Japanese negotiator, Jutaro Komura, arrived first and enhanced Roosevelt's largely positive opinion of the Japanese. I have seen Baron Komura and am favorably impressed with him, Roosevelt told Will Taft, Root's replacement as Secretary of War. Komura's counterpart, the Russian Sergei Witte, struck Roosevelt less well. Witte, Roosevelt complained to Spring Rice, had talked like a fool to the press regarding Japan. The only possible justification of his interviews is to be found in his hope that he may bluff the Japanese, in which he will certainly fail. The central sticking point of the talks was whether Russia would pay an indemnity to Japan. The Japanese government had led its people to expect a handsome indemnity, which would help compensate loved ones for lives sacrificed in fighting that meant little intrinsically to most Japanese. The Russians, having lost so much already, naturally resisted having to give up more. While maintaining physical distance from the negotiations, Roosevelt kept thoroughly apprised of the progress and lack of progress at Portsmouth. The Russian ambassador, Roman Rosen, frequently came to see him at Sagamore Hill, likewise Kaneko for Japan. As before, the Japanese appeared to Roosevelt far more reasonable than the Russians, who still seemed unable or unwilling to accept the depth of their disaster in the war. The Japanese quietly set aside a number of their initial demands and were willing to entertain a smaller payment from St. Petersburg than they had initially proposed. Moreover, they offered to drop the terminology of indemnity and let the Russians call it a payment for transfer of control of the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. The northern half of the island would be restored to Russia by Japan. This struck Roosevelt as fair of Tokyo, and he told the Russians as much. He wrote Tsar Nicholas, urging him to accept. "It seems to me that if peace can be obtained substantially on these terms," the president said, "it will be both just and honorable, and that it would be a dreadful calamity to have the war continued when peace can be thus obtained." At the same time, he wired his old friend Speck von Sternberg, now German ambassador to the United States, relating what he was telling the Tsar and suggesting that Kaiser Wilhelm apply his own persuasive skills to the task. While awaiting a response from Nicholas to his efforts to push St. Petersburg closer to Tokyo, Roosevelt attempted to tug Tokyo closer to St. Petersburg. He urged the Japanese to moderate their indemnity demand further. However reasonable in principle a payment might be, it would prove unreasonable if it caused negotiations to fail. "You know how strongly I have advised the Russians to make peace," he told Kaneko. "I equally strongly advise Japan not to continue the fight for a money indemnity. If she does, then I believe that there will be a considerable shifting of public opinion against her." Public opinion aside, if Japan continued the war, it would quickly squander on the fighting whatever it might hope to squeeze from the Russians as an indemnity, and would come out no better than at present. End quote. Okay, so what do we see here? We see that we start getting into the particulars of the negotiations. So Japan is looking for an indemnity. Japan is looking for cash, a cash payment. It apparently the Japanese government had led its people to believe that there was money coming on the way. And then it started to look in negotiations like there might not be any money or there might not be much money. Now, think about this. So Japan attacked Russia. Japan beat Russia at Port Arthur, advanced into Russian territory, and then annihilated the Russian fleet. Japan has won this war. Now, in the olden days, the winner of a war would basically get paid off to go away, would take resources, the booty, right? The spoils of war, would take resources and then go away. This indemnity. The Japanese people are expecting to get paid. That this whole operation they're gonna get money. I mean, they've won. They've beaten the Russians for all practical purposes, and they expect that they deserve the spoils of war. Russia, of course, doesn't want to give up any money. And Teddy Roosevelt is trying to convince the Japanese, well, it's not really in your best interest to continue this fight. You're not going to get anything out of it that's going to make any indemnity that you might get down the road any more worthwhile versus the amount of people that are going to die and the amount of costs of the war for you to continue fighting. But I think it's interesting, he's not saying to them, whose fault it is. Like, well, Japan, it's your fault because you initiated the attack on Russia, and therefore you need to be punished in these negotiations. That Japan has some sort of moral, culpability that needs to be expiated in order for peace to be reached. The question is not as much about who started it. The question is more about who won. The question really for Teddy Roosevelt is mostly about how do we get to peace? And if there's no cash payment for Japan, then that's what it's going to have to be, because that's how we get to peace. But he's still entertaining the notion that there will be some indemnity, there will be some payment. Japan's honor demands payment. So it's just interesting the way that this conflict is dealt with and addressed versus how we would address such a thing at the present. So then, closing out this negotiation section is this here, where the author says, quote, "For 48 hours, the conference verged on collapse. Nicholas, fearing incipient revolution in his own country more than a resumption of fighting in the Far East, and fearing that weakness against the Japanese would encourage the revolutionaries, persisted in his niet. At the last possible moment, however, Roosevelt's arguments took hold, not with the Russians, but with the Japanese. Tokyo finally came around to the president's view that an indemnity wouldn't cover the costs of continuing the war, and it dropped the demand. Tell Baron Komura that I am overjoyed at the news, Roosevelt wired Portsmouth. To the Japanese emperor, he conveyed his earnest congratulations upon the wisdom and magnanimity Japan had displayed. Roosevelt's message to Russia's Nicholas was more restrained. I congratulate you on the outcome, he told the Tsar, and I share the feelings of all sincere well-wishers to peace in my gratitude for what has been accomplished. To Germany's Wilhelm, Roosevelt expressed his profound appreciation for the Kaiser's cooperation. Privately, Roosevelt credited Tokyo for the settlement. I think the Japanese government has acted most wisely, he said. Regarding the Russians, he was still angry. There were moments during the peace conference at Portsmouth, he confided to Arthur Lee, when I earnestly wished I could get the entire Russian government to the top of Cooper's Bluff and run them violently down a steep place into the sea. Yet now that it was over, the president was satisfied with the solution. It all came out right in the end, he told Lee. The deal was a sound one, and not only for the belligerents. I think the peace is just to Russia and Japan, and also good for England. This letter was to Spring Rice, and the United States. End quote. So ultimately they reach a conclusion. Russia doesn't want to appear weak because it is having problems with revolutionaries and fears that weakness in the face of the Japanese would provide more momentum to Russia's revolutionaries. So the Russian leadership thinks they'd rather have additional war with Japan than have to have more powerful and aggressive revolutionaries at home. And ultimately, those revolutionaries did, in fact, overthrow the Tsar. So there you see how it all ended. He wasn't particularly happy with the way the Russians behaved. He was very happy with the way the Japanese behaved. He really seems enthusiastic about the Japanese. And like I said, there were other parts, there was a little bit more that I didn't read, where he continues to heap praise upon the Japanese and continues to be dismayed with the Russians. Now, moving on a little bit, there becomes more problems with the Japanese that now tie in with immigration. And so that's the part I want to address here. He says, quote, prior to Portsmouth, government officials in Tokyo had made grand promises about an indemnity. When they came home empty-handed, the Japanese people were predictably disappointed. No more than politicians anywhere did Japan's leaders like to confess their folly in raising expectations unreachably high. Seeking a scapegoat, they blamed Roosevelt. Anti-American riots erupted in Tokyo and other Japanese cities, even as the Nobel Committee in Norway was choosing him for its Peace Prize for bringing reconciliation to the Far East. Committees of public protest in Japan were targeting him for abuse, for bringing shame to their country. Hotheads went as far as to talk of war with the United States. Yet, if some of the Japanese outrage against America was undeserved, no small part was fully earned. The anti-Asianism that had motivated the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which had been extended in 1892 and rendered permanent in 1902, had lately focused on Japanese immigrants. As before, the animus against the immigrants from across the Pacific was informed by influences economic, cultural, and racial. West Coast workers objected to the low-wage competition of Asian coolies, and they and their neighbors feared and despised the immigrants' exotic beliefs and lifestyle. The immigration issue, thought to have been settled by the laws barring Chinese, the earliest and most numerous of the Asian immigrants, had recently flared up again, following the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. Scores of thousands of Japanese had migrated to Hawaii before annexation. Thousands continued to do so. Under the terms of the Treaty of Annexation, they could move on freely to the American mainland. The Japanese immigration issue came to a head during Roosevelt's second term. In October 1906, the San Francisco School Board mandated the segregation of Asian schoolchildren into an institution called the Oriental Public School. The order embraced Korean and Chinese children as well as Japanese, but both Korea and China had troubles aplenty without worrying about what school their immigrant children were attending in far-off California. For Japan, however, lately accustomed to thinking itself the equal of the Western countries, a belief underscored by the thrashing just administered to Russia, the San Francisco action came as an egregious insult. First, the Americans had deprived Japan of its hard-won indemnity. Now they were classing Japanese children as no better than Chinese and Koreans. Roosevelt, for all his embrace of the democratic ideal and his confidence in the common people, had never held state or local governments in particularly high esteem. The pests of the democratic process, he believed, fed most freely on the grassroots. He knew this to be true in the New York City of Tammany Hall and the Albany of the Black Horse Cavalry. He suspected it was true of California as well. Since the Portsmouth Conference, he had grown concerned over the deteriorating conditions of U.S.-Japanese relations. The edict of the San Francisco School Board promised to deal these relations a sharp and utterly unnecessary blow. He told Kermit he was horribly bothered about the Japanese business. He added, "The infernal fools in California and especially in San Francisco insult the Japanese recklessly." Considering the sensitivity of the Japanese people and the idiocy of the Californians, Roosevelt didn't deem war entirely out of the question. However, he said, "I hope to keep things straight. I am perfectly willing that this nation should fight any nation if it has got to, but I would loathe to see it forced into a war in which it was wrong." Roosevelt immediately set to dampening the combustibles. He wrote to Baron Kaneko expressing his gravest concern at this affront to Japan, and assuring him that the San Francisco action no more represented American opinion than recent misdeeds against Americans by some Japanese seal poachers represented Japanese opinion. He said his Justice Department was taking measures through the courts to invalidate the school board's directive. At the same time, though, he had to acknowledge the constraints under which even a president operated. Our form of government, which has many advantages, has some disadvantages, and one of them is dealing with movements like this. Roosevelt laid plans to use federal troops to protect Japanese immigrants from mob violence if things came to that. Meanwhile, he sought to strike the problem of anti-Japanese feeling at its source. "In the Japanese matter, the crux is the bringing in of the Japanese laboring men," he explained to Lyman Abbott. "Whether we like it or not, I think we have to face the fact that the people of the Pacific Slope, with the warm approval of the labor men throughout our whole country, will become steadily more and more hostile to the Japanese if their laborers come here, and I am doing my best to bring about an agreement with Japan by which the laborers of each country shall be kept out of the other country. I want to make things so pleasant for Japan, if I possibly can, that with the entire self-respect they can propose or assent to such a proposition." Roosevelt's posture in this regard was partly rhetorical. The situation between the two countries was nowhere near as symmetrical as he suggested. American laborers were not lining up to enter Japan. The flow was all in the other direction. Yet by pointing to barriers to American entry into Japan, he could construct a case for keeping Japanese workers out of the United States. Though not a zealous immigration reformer like Lodge or any number of other contemporaries, Roosevelt conceded the legitimacy of part of the restrictionists' argument. Speaking of businessmen who wrapped themselves, cynically as he thought, in the mythology of immigration as a vital part of the American dream, Roosevelt asserted, "I have not the slightest sympathy for big men who want to bring in cheap labor, whether Japanese, Chinese, or any other. Neither did he have any moral qualms about limiting the number of Asian workers allowed to enter the United States. America was not the world's dumping ground for the overflow of other countries. Yet he insisted that his country do justice to any it did allow in. Rumblings in the West indicated a desire to prevent Asians from exercising voting rights and other aspects of citizenship. This would be unfair and unwise. It does no possible good to deprive those who are here of the franchise. On the contrary, I think that we should studiously give the franchise and school facilities to, and in other ways treat as well as possible all the Japanese that come. What Roosevelt feared was not immigrants per se, but immigrants kept beyond the pale of full participation in American life. We cannot afford to regard any immigrant as a laborer. We must regard him as a citizen. End quote. Okay, so there's certainly a lot going on here. We have now this becomes an immigration issue, and certainly an immigration situation that is fairly familiar to us today. It seems as though what we see here is that first of all, the Japanese leaders don't get what they want in the negotiations regarding the war with Russia. And the Japanese people are upset when the Japanese leaders come home empty-handed. And so what do the Japanese leaders do? Well, they don't want to take the blame. The Japanese people thought they were going to get money from Russia. They won the war after all. They kicked Russia's butt in the battle at sea. They took Port Arthur. They took all this land. The Japanese won by any measure, and now they're coming home empty-handed. And that's how the Japanese are looking at this. Like, we won. Why aren't we getting our just spoils? Which is totally different than how we might look at something today, where we would say, well, whoever, it doesn't matter who wins, whoever initiated the conflict should get nothing out of it. No territory, no indemnity, no cash payment, no nothing. But the Japanese expected something because they had won the war. And so the Japanese people are upset, and the Japanese leaders make America the scapegoat, at least according to this author. So while Roosevelt is bending over backwards to try to, heap praise upon the Japanese leaders are going back to their people and saying, well, it's America's fault. We didn't get anything out of that. America stepped in to negotiate a settlement that benefited Russia, who had lost the war. It basically gave Russia a way out of the war. And the Japanese went home empty-handed. And the Japanese are telling this to the Japanese people. And the Japanese people are upset. And now there's anti-American riots in Japan. So then a little bit later, there becomes anti-Japanese riots in California. And we start getting laws passed in California and in San Francisco that set up separate schools for Japanese children, or it's really for all Asian children have their own school system set up. And the Japanese are up in arms about this. But meanwhile, we have a Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was extended in 1892 and rendered permanent in 1902. So it had been passed by the federal legislative bodies 3 times. Then at the state level, laws are getting passed to minimize the ability of immigrants to interfere with the Californian prosperity. The ability of immigrants, low-wage immigrants, to show up and drive down the wages of the Californian workers. They're upset about it. The Japanese are breaking American law by showing up in disregard of our immigration restrictions. And when the American people get upset about it, Teddy Roosevelt is all apologetic to the Japanese. Oh, I'm sorry, we have to deal with stuff like that here in our democracy. We have to deal with people. Meanwhile, Japan has anti-American riots. But who shows up in Japan to raise a fuss from America about their riots? The Japanese are in America telling Americans how to manage their school systems, how to manage their immigration policies, what their border policies should be. And Teddy Roosevelt is bending over backwards for the Japanese, but the Japanese aren't bending over backwards for the Americans. The Japanese are bending over backwards for their own people who want to come to America. So let's move to the next section. Here he says, quote, "It was the Californians who angered Roosevelt the most. Out of either parochial ignorance or fatuous selfishness, he judged, they were putting the narrow and misguided interests of one city and state ahead of the interests of the nation as a whole. To drive home the likely consequences of their actions, Roosevelt invited, all but ordered, in fact, members of the San Francisco School Board and the city's mayor to Washington. He called in California's congressional delegation. He wrote long letters to the newly elected and conveniently Republican governor of California. To this last individual, James Gillett, Roosevelt explained that the violent extremists who were stirring up the Japanese issue were making it nearly impossible for him to accomplish the very goal they professed to pursue. Roosevelt shared the objective of keeping out Japanese laborers, but he argued that gratuitously insulting the government of Japan was hardly the way to accomplish it. Congress had not seen fit to bar entry to workers from the advanced and even those not so advanced countries of Europe. To single out Japan for special and unfavorable treatment would needlessly aggravate tensions that already existed between the United States and the most advanced and powerful country of Pacific Asia. The president went on to say that he had been engaged in quiet negotiations with the Japanese government, which had pledged to prevent the emigration of laborers to the United States as long as Japanese already in America suffered no official discrimination. Moreover, in his continuing conversations with members of the San Francisco board, he had elicited an agreement that promised to save the face of both sides. All foreign children, whether Japanese or other nationality, would be placed in separate schools or classes when either their advanced age or their lack of fluency in English prevented their participation in regular classes. A solution satisfactory to almost everyone was near. The national government has met with only one difficulty in securing this object, Roosevelt explained to Governor Gillett, and that is the difficulty caused by these foolish or designing agitators who most loudly repeat the cry of Japanese exclusion at the very moment that they are doing all they can to prevent its becoming a fact. Roosevelt wasn't so blunt as to tell Gillett to crack these crazies into line. The president didn't know who else would be reading the letter, and besides, Gillett could no more dictate to Californians than Roosevelt could. But he expected the governor to derail some additionally insulting bills that were working their way through the California legislature at that very moment. Roosevelt's stiffening letter paid off. The governor shared the president's sentiments with leaders of the California Senate, which duly turned back the measures in question. Yet Roosevelt soon learned of another anti-Japanese initiative afoot in Sacramento, and he felt obliged to address another, longer, and even more forceful letter to the governor. The agreement with Japan was essentially complete, he explained. It therefore appears that we now have absolute power to exclude all Japanese laborers from this country, and that the only obstacle to thus securing their exclusion lies in the action of those unwise and sinister agitators who seek to delude the good people of California, and especially of San Francisco, into a course of action which will defeat the very object they profess to have in view. With this additional encouragement, Gillett throttled the latest provocative measure, allowing the so-called gentleman's agreement with Japan to slide sedately into effect. The bargain was, as Roosevelt had explained it earlier, no formal American barriers to Japanese immigration, and no legal discrimination against Japanese in the United States, but informal measures by Tokyo to prevent additional emigration to America by Japanese workers. Gentleman that he was, Roosevelt refused to crow publicly over what amounted to a significant victory for his method of quiet but firm diplomacy. Yet he did allow himself one private boast. He told Andrew Carnegie, "In this Japanese matter, I can say with all sincerity that I doubt if any president could have done more to secure peace than I have done." He added, with an indeterminable degree of exaggeration, "The situation was at times a very dangerous one." End quote. Okay, so now we get to the gentleman's agreement. And the gentleman's agreement is not very strong. So what we get are no formal American barriers to Japanese immigration. So first of all, step 1, we throw the gate open. Step 2, no legal discrimination against Japanese in the United States. Okay, that's fair, but what are the distinctions of citizens? Because it seemed as though, in his previous statements, it seemed as though Roosevelt thought that everyone who showed up from Japan should get the vote and all the rights of a citizen. So, no legal discrimination against Japanese in the United States. What does that translate to? Complete citizenship for all Japanese in the United States? And then what does Roosevelt get from the Japanese? Informal measures by Tokyo to prevent additional emigration to America by Japanese workers. Just informal measures. Nothing concrete. There's nothing there. There's no there. It's just, we promise we won't keep sending Japanese workers. And that's it. It's just an informal measure. Informal measures by Tokyo. Nothing legal, nothing concrete, nothing definable. And yet the author describes this as a significant victory for his method of quiet but firm diplomacy. And he keeps contacting, he calls everybody into Washington and he keeps telling them all, we're on the verge of getting what we want. We just got to quiet these guys down. But they didn't really get anything that they wanted. He didn't really get what they wanted after all. That was nonsense. We're on the verge of getting what we want. No, not really, because let's look to the next section where he says, quote, "The gentleman's agreement of the previous February had failed to eliminate tensions between the United States and Japan for the simple reason that a sizable number of those responsible for the tensions were not gentlemen. In May, anti-Japanese riots convulsed San Francisco as Californians, discontented with Roosevelt's executive accord, sought to vent their anger on the Japanese population of California's first city. Meanwhile, the counterparts in Japan to the Californians refused to accept any curbs imposed by the Japanese government or anyone else on the right of Japanese to migrate to America. Although statistics were hard to come by, the complaints of this group seemed to have caused the Tokyo government to be less stringent in upholding its end of the bargain than it might have been. Roosevelt was annoyed by Tokyo's failings, but he was incensed at the Californians and their supporters elsewhere in the country. Our people act infamously when they wrong in any way the Japanese who are here," the president asserted. And those individuals who inflamed the situation for their own benefit acted most infamously of all. Upon hearing scurrilous rumors being retailed as fact by certain journalists, Roosevelt responded that he would like to trepan the various editors who are striving to cause trouble with Japan. But in his cooler moments, he recognized that not even the generous construction of executive powers allowed drilling skulls. Consequently, he resorted to the tested technique of jawboning, applied first to his Japanese acquaintances. He wrote to Kaneko, "My dear Baron," reassuring his friend that the more responsible and enlightened elements in American society respected the Japanese and cherished their goodwill. "Among the friends whom I especially value," he volunteered, "I include a number of Japanese gentlemen." But relations between the United States and Japan were too new for this respect to have filtered down to the masses. "We must not press too fast in bringing the laboring classes of Japan and America together." The president pointed out that American workers weren't unique in their fear of foreigners. If scores of thousands of American miners went to Sakhalin, or of American merchants to Japan or Formosa, trouble would almost certainly ensue. He told Kaneko that he was doing what he could to facilitate good relations between the two countries, and he hoped Kaneko would do the same. Through the course of the summer, Roosevelt continued to try to pour oil on the troubled waters of northern Pacific. "I have the Japanese ambassador and a cabinet minister out here the day after tomorrow," he informed Lodge from Oyster Bay in July. "I shall continue to do everything I can by politeness and consideration to the Japs to offset the worse than criminal stupidity of the San Francisco mob, San Francisco press, and such papers as the New York Herald." Hotheads on both sides of the ocean were talking loosely about war. Roosevelt didn't pay inordinate attention to such stupidities, although he couldn't help noting them. I do not believe we shall have war, but it is no fault of the yellow press if we do not have it. The Japanese seem to have about the same proportion of prize jingo fools that we have. The cabinet minister Roosevelt spoke of to Lodge was actually a former cabinet minister, but this minor inaccuracy was more than offset by the fact that the individual in question was Admiral Isokuro Yamamoto, ex-Navy Secretary and later Prime Minister, and a man who was roughly Japan's equivalent of A.T. Mahon and Roosevelt rolled into one, in terms of strengthening and modernizing his nation's fleet. Yamamoto arrived in a bad mood and remained huffy throughout the meeting. He demanded indignantly, the indignation only partly filtered out by his interpreter, that Japanese laborers must be allowed to enter the United States on exactly the same terms as European workers. Anything less was an insult to Japan's honor. Roosevelt was polite, but he wasn't going to take this, even from a former cabinet minister. Japanese arrivals in the United States were up from the previous year, despite the gentleman's agreement. Many of them who come as petty traders are really laborers, Roosevelt explained to Yamamoto. Roosevelt didn't quite accuse the Japanese government of cheating, but he stoutly and repeatedly rejected the admiral's demand. I kept explaining to him that what we had to do was face facts, that if American laboring men came in and cut down the wages of Japanese laboring men, they would be shut out of Japan in one moment. Roosevelt asserted that economics, not racial thinking, lay behind his administration's insistence on curtailing Japanese immigration, and his administration would indeed insist. I told him emphatically that it was not possible to admit Japanese laborers into the United States. Yamamoto may or may not have been impressed by Roosevelt's defense of American prerogatives in establishing American immigration policy, but the admiral could not have helped listening carefully when Roosevelt let drop that the United States battleship fleet was preparing for massed exercises in the Pacific. From the time of the Russo-Japanese War, Roosevelt and American naval officials had sporadically entertained the idea of sending America's biggest warships from the Atlantic, where they were regularly stationed, to the Pacific. The voyage would be a shakedown cruise, revealing where logistics needed to be improved. It would also serve as a reminder to the Japanese, who were not surprisingly felt rather proud of themselves, that the United States was a Pacific power to be reckoned with. Yet precisely this latter purpose seemed to some an argument against the voyage. Amid the rapid deterioration of U.S.-Japanese relations, the Japanese government might interpret a redeployment of the American fleet as a provocation. If Tokyo were contemplating war, it might not wait for the big ships to arrive in the Pacific, but would indeed strike first, thereby triggering the conflict Washington wanted to avoid. A second argument against the voyage, more or less important in various quarters, was that it would cost millions of dollars that didn't really need to be spent. Roosevelt paid no mind to the argument that an audacious American move might provoke a war. He had built a career on provocation of one sort or another. More to the point in the present case, he felt that weakness was far more provocative than strength. Consequently, the worse relations with Japan grew, the more necessary he deemed the voyage. As for the expense, a war would be far more costly than any practice cruise. While the president refused to skimp on the costs of preparation for war, in his conversation with Yamamoto, he economized somewhat on the truth. He described the anticipated journey of the fleet through the Pacific, then declared, as he recounted the meeting to Root, that it would return home very shortly after it had been sent there, at least in all probability. In fact, Roosevelt had something far more ambitious in mind. As he told Lodge a few days earlier, "This winter we shall have reached the period when it is advisable to send the whole fleet on a practice cruise around the world." End quote. Okay, so here, we have a lot of the same, it's the Californians' fault. He's always upset and irritated with the Californians, but the gentleman's agreement is falling apart, and the Japanese are not upholding their end of the bargain. So the whole situation was supposedly solved by this gentleman's agreement, and yet the Japanese aren't holding up their end of the gentleman's agreement. And he doesn't seem to have much of anything to say. He's mad at the Californians because the Californians are still upset because they felt that the gentleman's agreement didn't do anything. The Californian people are upset with the gentleman's agreement. They feel like it's not working. The Japanese are still sending more people than they're supposed to. They're not upholding their end of the bargain. And Roosevelt is mad at the Californians. And he's not upset with the Japanese. So the aggressive immigrants in Japan, the people who want to come to America and are advocating for more and more capacity to go work in America, in Japan, those guys are getting the ear of the Japanese government. And the Japanese government is really kind of turning the other way, right? Turning a blind eye to Japanese laborers who are coming to America above and beyond the number that are supposed to go, which is really seems to be zero. And the Japanese government doesn't really seem to mind. But they get all upset at what the Californians do, and Roosevelt takes their side. Instead of taking the side of the Californians, he never takes the side of the Californians, despite the fact that he knows that Japan would never put up with what the United States is currently putting up with. And yet he continues to rail against the Californians. And then it comes out about the fleet is going to take a trip around the world. Oh, this might be provocative against the Japanese, right? Tensions are already bad with the Japanese. This might be provocative and push us toward war. Oh, President Roosevelt doesn't mind being provocative. He's built a career on being provocative. You have to show strength, right? But yet, when it comes to the border, there's no strength there. It's always an attempt to appease Japan. Oh, we don't want to hurt Japan's feelings. There's a sort of mindset here. We're happy to send our military around the world, right? But to protect our own borders from an endless flow of immigration outside of our own laws, like to enforce our own laws about our border, is just beyond the pale. But the international military posture, well, who cares how provocative that is? It doesn't really make much sense. Because why are tensions with Japan so bad in the first place? Japan's upset because they didn't like the way the deal with Russia turned out. You know, it seems like the Japanese government just gives the Japanese people what they want. When the Japanese people are upset, even if they don't have cause to be upset, the Japanese government appeases them. The Japanese government makes scapegoats out of the United States. I don't see how the Japanese government is treating the United States in a fair, respectful way in any of this. But Roosevelt is terrified of offending the Japanese unless it gives him a chance to, show off his new boats. He goes on to talk about the fleet that sails around the world a little bit more, but it doesn't really have all that much to do with Japan. He does talk about the Philippines a little bit, but I'm just going to leave it at that, and you can make what you will of Roosevelt's disposition toward the Japanese and toward the border and toward international politics, and whether or not he was right in any of it or wrong, and how successful he was in the end when you consider that less than 40 years after the end of the war between the Japanese and the Russians, the Japanese turn and attack us at Pearl Harbor with a similar sneak attack to the one that they deployed against Russia in Port Arthur. So whether or not war was averted over the long term, clearly it wasn't. And yet, how about the immigration policies that were in place that Roosevelt was loath to enforce? Those restrictions are long gone, and our immigration policy today is probably the greatest weakness that America faces. Our greatest problem and our greatest struggle in the 21st century is, for us and for Western civilization as a whole, is contending with unrestricted immigration flows. So the immigration turned out to be a massive problem, and Roosevelt was not actually able to prevent war by either appeasing the Japanese nor by posturing. And I will leave it at that. Thank you for listening.